4 days ago I posted a video that was an hour long, and said that if it could reach 500 likes I would do another. This is me delivering on that promise. I actually had a ton of fun recording this video, so if there is similar support on this one, I'll try and do another one in the near future. So if you enjoy these longer videos, be sure to drop a like, as it not only takes a quick second and helps promote the channel, it also lets me know that I did something right. In today's video, I will be telling 7 stories. Each one will be bringing something unique to the table, from a library with a strange history, to a story of an abandoned road. We will be delving into the paranormal, the supernatural, and just the strange and bizarre. A huge thank you to the writers. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. If you're new around here and you enjoy the content, please be sure to subscribe, as it is always appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. There's a trail near my house. It winds through a small park and then into a narrow strip of woods before running along a field beside a housing division. From there, it goes past a cornfield, and then loops through the woods again. There's a pond at the fork, where the loop begins. It's covered in water lilies and they bloom white and pink in the spring. And there's a stone, flat-topped and broad, upon which people leave coins or trinkets as they enter the woods. I remember as a child being given a dime by my parents and told to place it on the stone. For the fairy of the woods, they said, so she'd bless us with luck. Then I got older and the story changed. She was a witch or a ghoul or some other evil dead thing. The gifts were no longer a luck charm, but tribute to appease her hatred. Those that failed to leave an offering didn't make it out of the woods. My friends and I ride our bikes along the trail often. It's packed dirt and gravel, and it's cooler underneath the shade of the trees. We all stop at the fork and leave something on the stone, like our parents taught us, and like everyone else that walks this trail. Even the runners with their spandex and water bottles find a pocket to slip a shiny rock or a quarter into to leave behind. Everyone in town knows about the tradition. Last month we stopped, and Kyle was the first to approach the stone. He didn't leave anything, however. He swept his hand along the top, sliding everything that was on it off and into his cupped palm. Then he poured the trove of coins and random junk into his pockets. I asked him what he was doing. My heart was beating faster just watching him, thinking of the woman in the woods. Watching, surely watching, as he stole what was hers. "You know someone is coming out here and taking this, right?" he said. "It's clean every morning. I'm probably doing them a favor by helping get the junk out of here." It was implied that whoever collected the offerings every night was a normal person, not a witch, not a ghoul. I felt like I was in grade school again, when the older students were telling us that we knew Santa was just our parents, right? And no one wanted to be the one to sound stupid by disagreeing, even though we hadn't known, and now the magic was ruined. Then he got on his bike again, and we were left to follow. I hesitated, thinking about the broken hair clip in my pocket, a metallic rainbow butterfly that I thought was pretty enough to leave behind. My other friends were moving on though, without leaving anything, and I didn't want to be the superstitious one, so I kept the hair clip in my pocket. We left the woods without incident, and I thought that was proof that Kyle was right, that it was just some silly game that everyone played along with because it was fun, like how we still left cookies for Santa, although now we left a Dr. Pepper instead of milk, because Dad really likes Dr. Pepper. Kyle used the money collected to buy a candy bar from the gas station on the way home. I was angry because he refused to share the money with the rest of us, and we had to go without. We had a new tradition after that. Kyle would stop and collect all the offerings from the stone when we entered the woods, and we'd parcel them among the group outside the gas station. If there was enough to buy candy, we'd go inside. Otherwise, we'd take our stolen spoils home, and maybe throw out the junk. I kept a lot of it in a shoebox under my bed. I like to collect things. My mom says I'm a pack rat, like my dad. A week ago, Maria told me that something strange happened while she was in the woods. She was with her parents on an evening walk, and she noticed that the trees were all silent. There were no birds and the air was still. Her parents didn't seem to notice anything odd, but she started looking around, peering into the trees and the growing shadows in the brush. And she thought she saw something, a hunched figure, white, Scuttering along the ground. It was large, far too large to be a dog. She'd grabbed her dad's sleeve and pointed it out to him. He peered into the woods, didn't see anything, and then stepped off the trail to investigate. Maria stood close to her mother's side and waited while he wandered through the trees for a moment, scanning his surroundings, before returning to tell her that he hadn't seen anything. Probably a raccoon, he suggested. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, however, and the next time we all went along the trail, she refused to take her share of the money, and Kyle kept it for himself. Then 4 days ago, we all saw her, the woman in the woods. We'd made a habit of going on the loop almost every day, as we were giddy with all the coins and neat things we were taking from the stone. Some of it was junk, like beer bottle caps, but there was always coins, and sometimes there was something interesting, like a chunk of quartz or a cheap metal bracelet. We were halfway through the loop, about to hit the shallow downhill portion. Kyle was in front, his pockets heavy with the stolen offering. The woods were quiet, as it was not very large, and there wasn't a lot of wildlife living in it. Then I heard a branch snap, like it was right over my shoulder, and I instinctively turned to look. All my friends pivoted as well, half standing on our bikes to turn around. We all heard it. A woman stood on the trail. Her hair was matted, her head was bowed so we couldn't see her face, and she wore a dirty white dress that stopped at her knees, the hemline tattered and trailing threads. Her hands hung loose at her side. None of us said anything. We didn't need to. As one mind, we all turned back around and bent over our handlebars. I pushed down as hard as I could, my breath caught in my chest, trying to get my bike going faster than it already was. The downhill helped. I shifted into my highest gear, hit my top speed, and we raced for the end of the loop and the trail that would take us out of the woods. I looked back once. The woman stood on the trail, the same distance away as she had been before. I thought, this is impossible. And that was the only thing I remember thinking, like it's frozen in perfect clarity in my mind. The image of that woman standing there on the trail. We didn't stop until we were at the park, and there were other people around. Only then, once we were across the wood bridge, did we stop. We spread out, jumping off our bikes and dropping them into the grass, panting and shaking with exertion. I hadn't ever rode my bike that hard. The air burned in my throat, and I desperately wanted something to drink. It was Maria that said we had to take it back, that we'd angered the woman in the woods, and she wouldn't forgive us unless we took it back and apologized. That started a fight. Kyle said we were just being cowards, that we hadn't seen anything weird, and it was just someone out running, and we were all letting our imaginations get the better of us. And we all fell into our own thoughts. Maria wanted to return it all. Steven thought that maybe this was a warning, and we should maybe just not take anything in the future. And Matt just didn't want to ever go in the woods again. Kyle finally grabbed his bike, yanked it upright, and jumped on. He pedaled off while we yelled at him to come back, and took all the stolen tribute with him. I went to the woods 2 days ago. I'm not certain why. I thought I had to prove to myself what had happened was real or not. I didn't leave anything behind on the stone. I think I was daring the woman to come out, to let me see her again, so I could know that she hadn't been some trick of the mind, that she was real. I was biking along at a good clip, trying to keep enough speed so that I wouldn't struggle to really accelerate if I had to be in a pinch. Then something moved on the trail ahead of me. Something small and thin and quick, and I braked hard, turning my bike sideways and dragging a foot on the ground to stop. It was a tiny garden snake. I had been about to run it over. I put down the kickstand and went over to herd it off the trail. I like snakes. I want one as a pet, but my parents keep telling me that the cats will kill it. It slithered away from me, off into the grass and then into the leaves. Satisfied, I looked up at the woods in front of me. The woman stood just yards away. She didn't move, and I stared at her. At her matted gray-brown hair and her paunchy white flesh, like she'd been left out in the rain too long. The woods were silent. There were no birds, and the only sound I heard was my own breathing. Finally, I took a step backwards. She took a step forward, and then my nerve broke and I turned and ran for my bike, jumping on it and trying to accelerate as fast as I could. fighting the gears to gain speed. I saw the woman out of the corner of my eye. She was on all fours and she seemed to flow across the ground, pulling herself along with long fingers, and her legs were skewed like a spider. Dry branches broke as she charged through them, and I heard her racing after me, and I thought she was gaining and I wanted to cry. My heart hammered in my chest. And then silence. And I realized I'd blown past the entrance to the loop and was on the trail back to the park. I glanced back and saw nothing behind me. I called everyone when I got home, told them we weren't imagining things, and to please stay out of the woods. Maria promised she would, and she sounded earnest. The others were more uncertain, but Kyle laughed at me and told me to stop making up stories. Yesterday, Kyle went missing. I heard the police downstairs an hour ago, talking to my parents. They wanted to know if I'd been with him earlier today, and they said no, that I'd been home all day helping with a garage sale. I didn't go downstairs to tell them what really happened. That he'd refused to listen to me, that he thought we were just imagining all of this, and that he'd gone out to the trail to prove that we were wrong, and take the tribute all for himself. My parents told me later that they were trying to find Kyle, and that he was probably okay, that sometimes kids ran off, but they wanted me to not go anywhere alone for a little bit, just in case. I typed all this up yesterday, and it's just been sitting here in Google Drive while I debated on whether or not to post it. I'm posting it now from my phone, because I want someone to know what's happened in case I don't come back. I didn't listen to my parents. I told them Maria was outside, and we were going to ride bikes together, and then I ran into the garage before they could see I was lying and got my bike. I had the shoebox with all the tribute I'd amassed under my arm, along with a roll of quarters to make up for what I'd spent. I went to the shrine. I dumped all of this out onto the stone. I thought maybe she'd understand that I was sorry, and I wanted to make up for not leaving offerings earlier. I've been kneeling in the grass for 20 minutes, staring at my phone. My knees hurt, and my feet have fallen asleep, but I'm terrified to move. There's a hand on my shoulder. The fingers are long and bony, the nails yellow, and wet dirt clings to the white skin. The forest is silent, and the only thing I can hear is my own breathing. I'm going to post this, then I'm going to stand up and turn around. When I was growing up, my mom would always tell us this story about how she is sure she met and talked to a ghost when she was a kid. I thought it would be a good fit for here. The story isn't going to be too long, and it might seem kinda predictable, but this is what she used to tell us. My mom was a little girl back in the early 1970s. One day, her mom, my grandma, took her and her brother to a kind of locally famous amusement park. My mom was very excited to be there because the park had been closed for a few weeks, and it had just recently opened back up. There was a new ride that had opened recently before the park closed that she wanted to ride. It was a new type of ride, and was being touted as the first of its kind. From what she said, it was a merry-go-round ride. But instead of just the horse themselves going up and down, the entire carousel itself was on a lift system, where machinery underneath it would pump the ride up and down as well, all while it was still slowly spinning, as merry-go-rounds do. At the full height, the carousel would be lifted something like 5 feet from the ground. Walking into the park, there was a corkboard with maps, news, events, what have you. That was in the center of the park entrance. She said she didn't pay much mind to this board upon entering, other than to look at the map to find where the carousel she wanted to ride was. She found where it was. But there was a problem. The ride was no longer in operation. My grandma apologized to her, and assured her that they'd be able to ride the regular merry-go-round as much as she wanted. My mom was a little girl though, and children don't really understand concepts of legalities, or what have you. So she of course interpreted the situation as her being not allowed to, or something being withheld from her unjustly. So she was kinda just being a little brat the whole time, making a fuss, and like a mischievous child sometimes do, she became determined she'd get to have what she wanted. When the three of them were on the very slow ride together, my mom took the opportunity to undo her safety belt and hop off the ride to go and find the carousel ride. This was the 1970s, and amusement park riders' safety and regulations and stuff weren't the best, obviously. I can only imagine this is the reason why she was able to slip off the ride completely unnoticed by employees at the time. Or maybe they did notice, and they just didn't care. Anyways, by sheer dumb luck, she somehow actually managed to find the carousel ride, and she managed to slip into the building that the carousel ride was in. As I mentioned earlier, the ride was one that would be lifted up and down. When she found the ride, it wasn't 100% down on the ground. She struggled to get up onto the ride and managed to. Then she sat on a reachable horse and waited for the ride to go. Unsurprisingly, it didn't, because, yeah, obviously, no ride operator. But little kids don't understand that type of thing anyways. So she got down and walked over to the control panel, blindly pressing different buttons to see if they would do anything. Nothing. So this leads to something I didn't mention until now. That machinery that the carousel was on that would lift it up and down, that wasn't 100% completely exposed. It wasn't in anything. There was no shielding or anything like it. This would pretty much never be allowed these days, but again, it was the 70s. So for whatever reason she decided, hey, I bet that if I go under the carousel, then I can press something there to get it to go. She walks over to the ride and is crawling on the floor to get her tiny body through the slight gap between the carousel and the ground. When she says she heard a voice, it said something along the lines of, "That isn't safe." When she looked over behind her, she told us she saw a woman, whose face she's never forgotten. She had big, beautiful, dark brown eyes, and straight brown hair that came down to her shoulders. Though her words were scolding, her smile was warm and kind. She was dressed in the same uniform a lot of the staff were wearing, so my mom assumed she was one of the workers there. The woman crouched down to meet my mom's eye level, as my mom abandoned her crawling position and instead sat up, looking up at the woman. From what my mom could remember, the woman asked her, "Did you get away from your mommy?" And my mom nodded. Then the woman said, "Don't you think she must be worried sick?" My mom had kept quiet at the question, and the woman offered my mom a hand and said, "We should go find her. Don't worry, she won't be mad at you." My mom took the woman's hand. She said it was cold, kind of like when you touch ice, but everything else about the woman was warm and comforting. The woman led my mom to the front of the building and leaned down again and put a hand on her shoulder and said, "You need to wait here and cover your ears nice and tight, okay?" My mom nodded and did as she was told. She looked straight ahead and, in retrospect, thinks that the woman must have pulled some kind of fire alarm or burglar alarm or something, because soon there was a loud wailing siren. Eventually some workers came to the location of the siren and saw her standing there alone, and she was reunited later with her mother. The mystery woman was right. My grandma wasn't mad, and she was just thankful to have my mom back unharmed and safe. My mom told my grandma what happened. My grandma went to guest services, so that she could ask to speak to the woman who worked there that helped her daughter, so that she could thank her. There was obviously some employees that were brown-eyed, brown-haired women, but all of them denied being the woman in question. When my grandma mentioned the ride this took place at, the faces of the staff she was talking to visibly changed and went white, and they became very tight-lipped and didn't talk to my grandma anymore, so my grandma just left. Back at the entrance of the park, as my mom, her brother, and my grandma were going to leave, my mom happened to look at the corkboard from earlier, and she says she will never forget that moment. Right there, on the corkboard, was a photo of the face that she had met earlier. She pointed out to my grandma, saying, "That's the lady." My grandma went over to the photo and read the words that accompanied the photo. She looked troubled, and then turned to my mom and said nervously, "This isn't funny. Let's go." My mom didn't find out until she was older and grandma told her, but apparently, that photo and text were a memorial to a worker that died weeks before. The reason that the park had initially closed, and the ride was taken out of operation. Because of this event, grandma had apparently done a small amount of research on the woman, by asking around, and word has it, while the ride was doing its up and down, she apparently tripped over some cables or wires, and ended up slipping partially under the ride, as it was on its way down to the ground. She was crushed to death. Personally, I don't know what to think. I'm not mentioning the park or the woman's name publicly, but trust me that I searched myself to see if I could verify anything. But I can't find any info online about it. It was so long ago and the internet is really new comparatively. So I guess that's not all too surprising that there are things that just aren't on it, That's the story though. You can take it or leave it on whether it was a ghost or not. And for what it's worth, my grandma insists that my mom must have seen the photo coming in and imagined the event, or had mistaken another worker for her. My mom was very young after all, and maybe the worker didn't come forward because she didn't want to get in trouble for pulling an alarm or something. My uncle doesn't remember any of this trip whatsoever. You ask my mom though, and she'll tell you she would bet her bottom dollar that the spirit of that woman came to her that day. She's certain of it. If you've ever been downtown, you may have seen a small building sandwiched between what used to be the courthouse and an abandoned storage unit. Yeah, well, it's a secondhand bookstore called The Printing Press. The sign above the door is too faded to read though, so everyone calls it Dalton's. Jerry Dalton is the owner, a 62-year-old chain smoker from Tennessee. Nevertheless, if you came inside, you'd notice how cramped the space is. There are books on tables, on shelves, in corners, and even on window stools. Then there's the musty smell of old books, and I mean old books. I swear some of these books must have been around when Jefferson was in office. That's how the store manages to get enough business to stay afloat. The books are damn near antique, the kind no other store has. And finally, you will most likely see a tall and thin woman in her 20s, with black hair covering her ears, and a complexion so pale, you can't look at her for very long. Yeah, that's me. The name's Chloe. I've been working there since high school, and I don't see myself calling it quits anytime soon. If there's one thing that's scarce around here, it's help. We used to have about 8 employees, but one by one they stopped coming into work, and one by one, we found their mutilated bodies at random places in the store. Except for Kim. A customer found her severed head on the cult shelf, and thought it was a Halloween decoration. I told Jerry multiple times to hire a paranormal investigator, but he calls me paranoid. He said there are no haunted places, and that it's all superstition. When I heard those words, I looked at him confusedly. Alright, I said. I'll give you that, but what about God and Jesus and heaven and hell? You talk about that stuff constantly. How is that any different from believing in wayward spirits? He told me to get back to work. But this isn't about Jerry. No, this story happened a week ago. It was about 6 o'clock, if I remember correctly. I was at the front desk updating inventory into the computer when I heard a thud upstairs. Max was upstairs shelving books at the time. You alright, Max? I hollered. There was no response. I shrugged it off as Max dropping a box of books, and thought no more about it. That is, until I heard another several loud thuds. I sighed deeply and trudged upstairs. I found Max on a stool putting up a couple books on the top shelf. A box of books that was on the cart next to him. What the hell? I asked, rolling my eyes. What the hell what? He replied, his brow furrowing. Those loud noises. I answered. What loud noises? I looked deep into his eyes. He slowly got down from the stool, took out 3 more books, and shoved them on the middle shelf. We didn't break eye contact the whole time. I voluntarily coughed to break the silence. Alright, just be careful. We don't want employees with broken necks. I turned around and walked back downstairs. Max was one of those guys who hated to be supervised. He almost never talked to Jerry, and didn't come to the monthly business meetings. I didn't know him well, in other words. Jerry didn't say anything about Max, though. Jerry was lenient, perhaps overly so. When I got back to the front desk, I heard another 3 or 4 thuds. I rubbed my temples and did my best to forget about it. By this point it must have been 6:30. The store was silent for the next 30 minutes, which was enough time to finish inventory. When I decided I'd walk around the store and straighten up the merchandise, I did that for another 15 minutes. That's when I heard 6 louder thuds followed by a high-pitched scream. It felt like my ears exploded. Max? I yelled as I jogged upstairs. But when I got to where Max had been earlier, he was gone. The box on top of the cart and the stool were exactly where I last saw them, though. I searched the upstairs and couldn't find him. Then I went downstairs. He wasn't there either. And finally to the parking lot out back. His car was still parked in its usual spot. Now I was puzzled. Max may have been antisocial, But he hadn't left work without alerting Jerry or me. He wasn't that kind of employee. So since I couldn't leave the store unattended, I did the next best thing. I called his cell phone. He didn't answer. At that, I called Jerry, who wasn't at the store at the time.
"Yellow?"
He asked in his usual southern drawl. "Jerry, thank God I got in touch with you. Max has gone missing. What should I do?" My shaky voice stammered into the phone.
I'd say wait for him to turn up. You'll find him eventually."
"Yeah, I'll find him dead. Maybe I should call the police, or maybe I should..."
"Chloe,"
snapped Jerry.
"for the love of Jesus Christ inside us all, please shut your mouth. Everything will be fine."
"Oh, absolutely," I retorted. "Everything went fine for Edgar and Kim and Lauren. Must I go on?" Jerry growled.
"Chloe, accidents happen, you know."
7 accidents in a short time span?
"It's possible, Chloe. Now please, don't start yapping about the supernatural again. I've gotta go. The church dinner won't be cooked by itself. And don't forget to lock up at closing time."
Then he hung up on me. I tossed my phone onto the desk, cursing Jerry for being so clueless, and cursing myself for the powerlessness. What was I to do? After all, for all I knew, I was going to be the next victim. I decided, since there was no customer in sight, to go upstairs and look much more thoroughly. Out of caution, I walked up the stairs very slowly and quietly, occasionally calling out for Max in a soft voice. But I'm not sure why I bothered with all that. Ghosts can see you after all, even if you can't see them. But I couldn't be sure it was a ghost. A vampire, maybe? No, none of the victims had punctured necks. What about a werewolf? No, that can't be it either. You'd think I might have found some hair scattered around. My mind was functioning at 1,000,000 miles a minute, with dozens of other possibilities, but none of them seemed to make any sense with what I knew. So I tried to put it out of my mind, and looked for signs of Max. I checked the windows. They were all locked. I looked at the hardwood floor carefully for any scratches or signs of a struggle. I couldn't find any. That's when I heard the thuds again. I jumped, but stayed as quiet as possible. The thuds seemed to be coming from above the ceiling. Above the ceiling, I thought to myself. I don't think there's anything up there but mice. And yet, those thuds could not be made by a mouse. I tiptoed back downstairs to look for Jerry's crowbar. I did my best not to mess with too much stuff in his office. I didn't want him to know I'd been looking around. He always told the employees to stay out of his office. But this was an emergency. The crowbar, it turns out, was in his liquor cabinet. I was a little disturbed at that, but this wasn't the time to psychoanalyze Jerry. I needed to look for Max, and at the very least, figure out what's making that sound I've been hearing all evening. I think it was 7:30 by then. When I got back upstairs, I stood there in the same spot I'd heard the thuds. I couldn't hear them anymore, but I knew all I needed to do was wait. I waited like a cheetah stalking a gazelle. My whole body was drenched in sweat, and I felt very gross, but that was only a small price to pay if I could find Max. The thuds finally came, and they were directly above my head. I got Max's stool, stood on it, and used the crowbar with unprecedented ease. I guess it's hard to know what you can do when you're pee-your-pants scared. I took the ceiling tile off methodically, so I didn't damage it, and slow enough so I could grab it with my hands and set it on the floor. I stood on the stool just staring at the newly made hole in the ceiling. I didn't know if I was scared or just questioning what I was doing in the first place. Sometimes I wonder if I had any idea what I was looking for, because I sure don't in retrospect. I guess I was on edge. My breathing was heavy though silent, and I even felt a little nauseous. Anyway, I finally got the nerve to look into the ceiling's hole. It was, as you'd expect, pitch black, and I could barely see anything. I shrugged my shoulders in relief, but when I turned to look at the other side, I was greeted by the most frightening thing I'd ever seen. I screamed louder than I thought was humanly possible, and tumbled off the stool and crashed onto the floor. I was so petrified that I was stuck lying in that spot. I stared up at the hole once more. I was certain I was startled by a human face, a very disgusting and deformed human face. But before I could meditate it, a few more thuds echoed from the hole. Then I heard the sound of something being dragged slowly and purposefully. as in my usual procedure in such scenarios. I closed my eyes and mumbled about wanting my mommy. My eyes involuntarily opened when I heard some large object dropped on the floor next to me. If I thought my scream before was loud, my second scream topped that by several decibels. I crawled backwards until I hit a wall. I was in denial of what I was seeing. It was Max. Well, or what was left of Max anyway. Half of his face was just muscle and bone, and his chest cavity was entirely ripped open. The body was also missing a leg, his right leg. The rest of his body had numerous bite marks, scratches, and cuts. The culprit soon dropped down. This time, I didn't scream. I was too shocked. The creature's face looked human, except its nose was flat. The ears were pointed and the eyes were large, and with diamond-shaped pupils. Its mouth was full of very sharp teeth. The body was also very human with long arms and legs, except it was crouched like a cat. The skin was a light blue, and it had wings folded at its side. Our eyes met, and my heart skipped 2 or 3 beats, and I almost forgot to breathe. It stood on its hind legs, and started walking towards me while its tongue twitched, and it cried out like a hawk. I was thinking about all the people that'd be at my funeral, and the list was, I confess, quite short. I was too much of a workaholic to have a boyfriend, and I was an only child. There was my dad, an uncle, and my maternal grandmother. You have some pretty strange thoughts when you think you're about to die. But then I remembered the mace I had in my pocket, and I thought, I don't want to die. I waited until the creature's face was inches from mine, and I sprayed it like my life was dependent on it. Because it kinda was. And I always thought mace was made for muggers. I should market some monster-specific mace. I bet I'd make a killing. But I got a C- in high school chemistry. Oh well, a girl can dream. Where was I? Oh yeah, the mace. The creature howled in irritation as it shook its head, which gave me enough time to rush downstairs. I pushed books behind me as I ran in the hopes of creating obstacles. I looked behind me and saw the creature quickly jumping onto walls to try to pounce on me. I was heading towards the door, until I felt something grab my leg and I hit the floor. I looked behind me, and saw the creature's spindly fingers around my ankles. It hissed at me, and bent over to try to start chowing down. Instinctually, I swung my hand and knocked it across the head. It fell over in pain. I suddenly backtracked upstairs. Remembering the crowbar, I grabbed it and hid behind a bookcase. I knew that wouldn't last long, but there was nowhere else to go. I heard the familiar thuds, and soon saw the thing above me upside down on the ceiling. It lunged, and I ran out of the way. I slammed into the bookcase, which fell sideways, and crashed into the next bookcase, which did the same thing like several dominoes. I was almost crushed. The creature at this point was furious. I hid behind one of the bookcases that wasn't toppled over, when all I heard was silence for about 30 seconds. I slowly tiptoed forward and peeked around the corner. The creature was there, and he spit some green mush at me. I ducked, thankfully, and saw the mush hit the wall. It bled right through the wall in seconds. I had to climb over bookcases to get back to the stairs, the creature spitting in my direction and creating holes in everything from the floor to the fallen bookcases. I was trying to rationally understand what to do, but I couldn't think at all. All that was active at that point was the lizard brain, which said I had to fight him off. I finally reached the front door, but I didn't rush outside as was my original plan. I slowly turned around to see the creature standing feet from me. It took a step forward, and I swung the crowbar like a baseball bat. It slapped the creature, which jumped in the air, flapping its wings violently. I slid underneath it and hit it again on the back of the head. Unexpectedly, the creature grabbed my arm and bit deep into it. I cried in agony and used my good arm to start punching it in the head. When it let go, I kicked it with my foot, which caused it to fall onto its stomach. My arm was bleeding like a waterfall, but I couldn't do anything about it. The odd thing is that I didn't even feel the pain in that moment. Maybe it was the adrenaline. "I'm done with you," I said to the creature, but really I was saying it more to myself, because I doubt the creature understood English. The creature got on all 4 legs and started flapping its wings again, until it was in the air in front of me. It let out a loud noise before coming at me. I jumped right at it and plunged the crowbar right into its left eye. The creature fell to the ground, its wing trying to cover the wound. I got on my knees, gave it one final look before finding the crowbar a home in its heart. The creature immediately stopped moving. I stood up, walked a few feet, and everything went black. I woke up in a room with almost blinding fluorescent lights. When my vision managed to focus, I realized I was in a comfortable bed with an IV in one arm and heavy bandaging on the other. My eyes started darting around, and I saw Jerry sitting in a chair near the end of the bed. He was looking at some trashy magazine. When he realized I woke up, he threw the magazine across the room. I wasn't reading that magazine. Jerry whined. It's just that. Don't judge me, Chloe. My head was throbbing. What? Where am I? You're in a hospital. A customer walked in around 8:30 last night and found you unconscious on the floor with books all over the place, he explained. When he said that, all the memories came flooding back over me. I sat up. Jerry, I found Max's body and there was this humanoid bat-like creature and I... Hush, Chloe. You need to rest. You lost a lot of blood. I don't know how in the world you made such a mess, but you're currently my only employee, so it's not like I'm gonna fire you or anything. What about Max? I questioned. You didn't find his body? What about that bat creature? Chloe, please, hold on a second. I was there and a customer was there, and even a couple policemen were there. We checked the entire place, and we saw no Max, and of course we didn't find any bat creatures. You need to stop reading those horror stories. Oh, and don't think it's just me here. I called your dad. He's been here with me, but he just went to the bathroom a minute ago. I nodded and let my head hit the pillow. I decided that I shouldn't argue with Jerry when I was recovering. Thankfully, my injury wasn't that bad, and I was out of the hospital the next day. But I didn't go back to work for a couple days. Jerry almost never gave me vacation time, so I gladly took it off when he offered. Anyway, that's it for this story. There are plenty more, because the printing press seems to attract everything from aliens to sentient robots. But I'm writing this on my lunch break, and it's about time to get back to work. Besides, there's some girl floating around the store moaning something about Satan rising again, so I should probably go check that out. Plus, we just got a new shipment of books that needs to be sorted, so I'll talk to you later. Sometimes, facing our fears is simply not worth the consequences. My name is Kevin and I'm a 26-year-old medical student, currently in my 3rd year. I have always viewed doctors as some sort of superheroes, able to rescue dying people and bring them back to life. Becoming a doctor has been my dream since I began to understand a fraction of the world around me, albeit superficially. Nothing worth of media attention has happened since I started studying here, but a week ago, there was an incident at the medical school. For unknown reasons, the news hasn't reported about it yet. Thus, I feel obliged to write about it here. There was a fellow student named Michael. We were good friends and understood each other very well. His wiry frame measured at least 6 feet in height, yet he was a quiet, rather shy person who didn't have many friends. However, that didn't seem to bother him too much. He was an excellent student, and made his way to the top of the dean's list several times. After classes, he would walk the same route to my dorm, and talk about anything under the sun, from how we would change the world with new inventions to disappointment with current political leaders. We have grown so close to each other that we share our innermost dreams and secrets with one another without fear of ridicule. Over the years that I spent with him, I learned that he was claustrophobic. The size of the room in which he was didn't matter, but the mere fact that he was trapped was enough to give him a panic attack. He has seen a consultant over many years, and his fear has reduced to a minimum. Yet he wasn't satisfied. One day, after classes, he suddenly told me that he's seen a YouTube video about people who faced their fears head-on, and eliminated them forever, and how inspired he was by their newfound quality of life. I've never seen him that happy and enthusiastic before. Knowing that Michael has always had a rather melancholic disposition, he told me that he wants to do the same for himself, and maybe record a video of him recounting his experience and post it on YouTube. At around midnight, he called me and said he was waiting downstairs. I snuck out, careful not to be caught violating the curfew, and met him outside. He asked me to accompany him to the deserted college and lock him in the anatomy lab. I asked him if he had lost his mind. I knew how such approaches can backfire horribly. Don't worry, it'll go away after 10 minutes, and then we'll go home. He reassured me. He didn't ask his therapist beforehand, saying he doesn't trust him, because he hasn't lost his fear despite spending years on therapy. Reluctantly, I followed him while berating him the whole time about his decision and trying to convince him not to follow through. Michael seemed unfazed. Nothing could dissuade him from his adventure. I couldn't let him go alone. Careful not to be spotted on CCTV, we stole the keys from the night shift security guard's office while he was making his rounds, and went to the basement where the lab is located. I made a desperate last-ditch attempt to dissuade Michael from going in. Friends help each other to become a better person, right? I'm trying to become one, and you don't want me to. What kind of friend are you? Reluctantly, I gave him the keys and he unlocked the door. He told me not to open it until 10 minutes later, no matter what happens. He went in and shut the door, taking the keys with him. The door had a second lock, which could only be opened with a key from either side, rendering me powerless should he suffer from a heart attack. The audible click of the lock sliced through the silence, like a hot knife through butter. I could hear him hyperventilating, and his rapid breathing grew fainter. As he walked away from the door to the other end of the room, I told him I had had enough, and I'm getting a spare key to let him out. He yelled for me to shut up and leave him alone. He was sobbing. His sobs grew progressively louder, and mutated into blood-curdling screams of agony. I yelled at him to come out, but he wouldn't respond. A loud crash came from within, as he probably threw equipment across the room, followed by more loud sobbing, more clanking of steel, crashing of glass, and cracking of breaking wood accompanied by loud sobs and wild screams. I couldn't take it anymore, and sprinted down the hallway, up the stairs and straight to the security guard's office. I didn't care that we got caught now. In the hallway leading to the entrance, I ran into him, and told him what happened while trying to catch my breath. We ran to the lab entrance, and I called out Michael's name. Silence. I called his name again, and asked him if he was okay, and that the security guard is here to let him out. Silence. The guard finally found the key and unlocked the door. The lights weren't working. Michael must have smashed the lamps as the floor was covered in glass, illuminating the room with his flashlight. The security guard went ahead to examine the room. Overturned dissecting tables everywhere. Medical equipment strewn about. From the other end of the room, we heard faint sobbing accompanied by a strange noise. It sounded like something chewing. The security guard shone his light beam in the direction the noise came from, and gasped at the grisly sight. Before us, on the floor, knelt Michael stark naked, bent over a cadaver, and chewing at its face. He stopped abruptly as the light beam struck his face, and slowly looked upward. His eyes had the look of a feral animal, and his mouth slowly contorted to a grin. Or better, what was left of it. Michael had cut away his lips, exposing his gums and teeth, and his face was smeared in coagulated blood. I realized that what I heard wasn't sobbing, it was giggling. With an almost inhumanly fast movement, he lunged at the security guard from his kneeling position and tackled him to the ground. I turned around and ran, the screams and Michael's maniacal laugh following me through the hallway. My lungs were burning and my heart close to exploding, yet I pushed myself to reach the exit. It was locked. I heard unnaturally fast running coming from the other side of the hallway, so I ran to the computer room and locked myself in. Suddenly a loud thump shook the room, followed by another one, as Michael tried to break down the door while laughing like a maniac. I wonder how he could muster up the kind of strength to cause the metal door to budge. Fearful of making a sound, I cowered on a computer desk at the far end of the room. I heard Michael sniffing at the door, and then it was quiet. I figured that he may want to lure me out by keeping quiet, so I decided to stay in the room. I quietly dozed off when a noise startled me awake. Something crawled with insane speed through the air duct on the ceiling. I looked up and saw Michael's mutilated grin behind the grid of the vent. I ran towards the door, unlocked it, and sprinted down the hallway, while hearing the grid covering the air vent dropping to the floor. I finally managed to find another exit door with the feral Michael in pursuit. I kept running, the adrenaline preventing me from passing out. He didn't follow me outside. I could see the faint glow of the coming sunrise on the horizon and raced towards it. completely exhausted. I called an Uber from my dorm room, packed all my things, and left for home. I quit medical school, much to the disapproval of my parents. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. Good that we had to move far away from this place, and I am currently finishing up my studies at another medical school. Michael and the security guard were never found, yet stories of people going missing at the medical school and around the area, and their mutilated remains found in the sewers are circulating the internet. Students and faculty members at the medical school report of strange noises at night, of something crawling or slithering insanely fast through air ducts and crawl spaces, of faint giggling in closets, of roaring laughter coming from the sewers. I don't believe in the supernatural, but I can't wrap my head around what has happened to Michael. I wonder how much of what was left of him could still be considered human. Just east of El Reno and west of Yukon, there's an old dirt road that runs parallel of I-40. It's old and overrun, and to be honest, I love it. Not because it creeps me out, but because I love that feeling I get just coasting through the countryside in the dead of night. It's like a big middle finger to those who refuse to go there after dark, because it doesn't faze me. Earlier, after I got off work, I decided to take that route again on the way home. Just crank up some Stone Temple Pilots and roll the windows down, and enjoy the cruise. But on this night, things were different. A lot different. I slowed down and tuned down the STP for a bit. The droning of I-40 just a soft hum at this point. I could see the lights from the semis dimmed down to a soft glow. I was coming up on the part of the road that divided a bunch of old, gnarled trees, which covered an abandoned farmhouse. I killed the headlights and let off the gas, slowing down and listening to the sounds of the night. I kept watching my rear view, in case someone came up to me. At first, there was nothing but the moonlit dirt road. Once I got parallel to the old farmhouse, I saw it. A blue shimmer in the middle of the road, several yards behind me. I stopped the truck, killed the engine, and turned the lights on, and watched for a few minutes. It shimmered like a bright body of water, only it was thinner at the top and deeper at the bottom. I watched it, squinting at it, trying to make sense of it as it shimmered and floated. It began to lift off the road and hold position. I was trying to decide whether or not to get back in my truck when I began to feel light in my head. My eyes began to water while staring at this thing, and I felt like I was about to vomit. I gripped the bed of the truck to keep from sliding down to my knees when it turned back on. The stereo fired a brief burst of static before STP's down began blaring. The full volume of the screeching guitars, this shimmering apparition, the smell of the exhaust, the nausea, it was all too much and I fainted. When I came to, everything was different. I woke up in a gray landscape that looked like the aftermath of an apocalyptic blast. The sky was covered in gray clouds that seemed to get darker off in the distance. My nausea was gone, so I stood up and saw that everything was destroyed. The only landmarks I noticed were the old farmhouse and a partially collapsed overpass dangling precariously over the interstate. There were no trees, or any sort of greenery in sight. I noticed then that my truck was gone too. No surprise, with the way things looked out here. I knew that it'd be asking for too much of a miracle. I began walking in the direction of El Reno, hoping to make heads or tails along the way of my situation when I heard it. Talking, coming from the farmhouse. I immediately became apprehensive. It's an old, busted-up farmhouse in the middle of a dead land. That's perfect reasoning to just run. But if there's someone else out there, maybe I could figure out just what happened. I walked up to the old house, the talking growing louder as I got closer. Only when I stopped through the faded white doorway did I realize I had bitten off more than I could chew. "Come," a voice whispered. I froze. "No," was all I could manage to say. I felt my body freeze into place, and I couldn't help but feel like a prey who has caught a faint whiff of its predator. "Come, friend," it said again. "No," I repeated, and began to step backward through the front door. Right as I was almost home free, I felt the door slam behind me. I ended up backing into a surprisingly solid wooden door. There was silence for a few moments. Then I heard something crash downstairs. I stayed silent. Then came a loud thump. Silence, then thump. It was silent for a bit, then the voice spoke up again. "Come here, friend. Come home," it said. I turned around and began to shimmy and pull at the door, shaking it violently, kicking it, hoping against hope that the fucking thing would just open. The door broke in half and I went spilling onto the porch. Immediately I got to my feet and began running, only to turn around and watch as a single leg, long and spindly like a black widow's, emerged from the front door. I watched with revulsion as it extended farther and farther out the door. My nausea came back as I heard a cacophony of crashing from inside the house. I saw something large and blacker than sin begin to fill the windows as my footing became wobbly. I tried to turn, but my legs felt like stone. I pulled and pulled, trying to run, instead falling on my face and blacking out. When I came to, it was dark, with the headlights from my truck illuminating the landscape. The trees and grass were back, as was the clear, moonlit nights, and the droning from I-40. I was back. I got up to my feet and looked down the road to see if the shimmer was still there, and thankfully it wasn't. I walked over to the driver's side in order to get in, wondering why I just went and left my truck running. When I grabbed my door handle, once I realized what I grabbed, the door handle began to yield and small, spindly appendages began to emerge, waving around at first. It took me a brief second to respond, but I pulled my hand back, right as the appendages tried to close over my hand. I jumped back, holding my hands as if it were wounded, and looked at the truck, not believing what I had just saw. My truck had just tried to grab me. Something has gone terribly wrong here. I'm in the process of moving, mostly due to what I saw while out with a bunch of friends. I'm 23 and pretty stout. I look fat, but there is a lot of muscle under the blubber. But I digress. My friends and I went up into the mountains to drink, party, and be pretty toxic. I was supposed to be the designated driver for my group of friends. I don't have a thirst for alcohol, unless something tragic happens, and I have to answer the call of the bottle. Gabe, my best friend, was pretty shit-faced already, and managed to convince the group that we should go up to the old mines, where a collapse happened, and play with a Ouija board. I wasn't really able to say anything since I was outnumbered by my drunk friends, and didn't want to let them go out into the dark forest without me. We headed up the trail leading to an old mine that collapsed and killed a lot of good people. There were lots of stories about this mine in particular, most notably that the men had unearthed an ungodly creature that ate people and had no eyes. I thought it was bullcrap, but you don't know how unnerving that stuff becomes when you're near it in the middle of the night. Gabe dug around in his backpack for a while, presumably looking for his Ouija board. Don't ask me why a 22-year-old brings a Ouija board to a party, because I still don't know why he brought one. I watched everyone start playing with it. Screw that, I thought to myself. I'm not going to get myself haunted by some old miner. After a bit of drunken shenanigans and fake movements, Gabe decided that there was no ghost, and that we should venture into the mines. Even while drunk, some of our friends disliked that idea, and said they'd rather not, but again, like I had before, they were outvoted. Most of the group took a heavy swig of liquor courage, and ventured into the mines. I hesitated and even thought about drinking some myself. I held off and joined them in their expedition, walking down the old moist tunnels, and kicking loose rocks. I thought it was really strange. Stones shouldn't be that loose, and some of it was coal. Why would the miners leave loose coal on the floor like that? I don't know, and at this point I don't care. We got down deep into the belly of the dark mine, illuminating the damp hole with little more than our phones. The tunnels were filled with drunken laughter, about the wet squishing sounds of our shoes against the floor. Someone went to go take a piss. I think it was Brian, but I'm not sure. And then Gabe started talking about what was rumored to have happened in those mines, which creeped me out more than it should have. He came back to the group without his pants on, and immediately I could tell he had sobered up quite a bit. Through some loud, heavy laughter, Gabe asked him what he had done with his pants. My guess was he had shat himself. He started to talk in a shaky and hushed voice. I couldn't hear him over the laughter. I knew he was talking, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. After everyone calmed down, it happened. He went to say what he had said again, but all he did was scream. Any buzz he had left was dead when Tom screamed too, followed by a loud and hard snap. I looked over and thought I was gonna crap myself. This horrible lake thing snapped another guy in the group's back like a twig and started to eat him. This isn't textbook, it swallowed him whole crap. This thing was sucking the meat off his neck. Everyone ran. We practically climbed over one another to get out of there. The whole time we were running, we could hear the sounds of that thing, ripping meat off the man and snapping bones to drink the marrow, like some kind of demented milkshake. I didn't see much of it, but I saw enough to where it haunts my nightmares. I can still hear it ripping meat off of him. I don't know who the guy was, and none of the people I asked did either. All I can hope for is that whatever God he believes in led him to a better place. I can't forget it. The pain creature with a pretzel for a spine holding the man like a balloon animal, while eating his neck like corn on the cob. This isn't something I can describe lightly. I saw a man being eaten alive. You can't unsee something that awful. I don't care how hard of a man or a woman you are. Jay counted heads, and we were one shorter than when we entered. I was thankful it only got one man. We called 911 after letting everyone know what happened. The police searched down there for what felt like an eternity. They didn't find any creature. All they found was the man's face with deep punctures in it. When they showed us, I gagged and threw up. The car ride home was tense. I didn't blame Gabe for what happened there. How could he have known? No one could have. I'm writing this as a warning. Do not go into the Appalachian Mountains. No matter how many of you there are, it will get one, and they will die. I haven't told this story in over 10 years. No one believed me when it happened. They thought I was going crazy. Honestly, I thought so too until I found this subreddit. Now I know I didn't imagine any of it. I was in college at the time, living on campus a good few hours away from my hometown. I'd planned a bus trip back to my parents like I always did when I was homesick. This time, I was extra excited about going back, as it was Thanksgiving weekend. Nothing like a homemade turkey dinner to cheer you up, am I right? Unfortunately, I got stuck in traffic on my way to the station, and missed my stupid bus. I cursed myself for always being last minute, knowing full well it was my fault. Looking at the schedule on my phone, I realized that the bus had been the last one going to my hometown for the day. I'd have to wait until the morning to catch the next one. It was past 8 p.m., so the ticket counter was already closed. Even the convenience store selling stale sandwiches and magazines had been shuttered for the night. I normally get tickets in the afternoon, so it was weird to see the bus station so empty and dark. There were still a few passengers scattered around the benches lined up in the atrium, but they were all quiet and kept to themselves. The dim lights gave off an eerie, post-apocalyptic vibe, but it had this weird, cozy feeling to it. It seemed like the perfect place to work on my economics essay that was due the week after Thanksgiving. The atrium was quiet and spacious, quite the opposite of my cramped dorm room. Plus, I knew my roommates had friends over for the evening, and I didn't feel like going back there right away. Her friends were super annoying. I took a spot in front of the big window, overlooking the loading dock. A couple of buses were still in the middle of loading passengers. People milled about in the cold November evening as they waited to get on. I watched a driver ram their luggage in the gaping compartments on the side of the bus, feeling annoyed that I wouldn't get to ride home that night like I was expecting. At that point in time, I really enjoyed taking these big buses with their plush seats, watching the scenery from high above the road. It used to be soothing. I don't think of it like that anymore, that's for sure. Crazy how your perception can change in a snap. I worked on my essay for a while, completely in the zone. I don't know how much time passed, to be honest, maybe 2 or 3 hours, when I finally lifted my eyes off of my laptop screen. The loading dock was empty. Fog had drifted in, swirling in the streetlights. There was no one else left in the building, and it somehow made the place look even darker. It felt wrong for me to be there all alone, as if I was doing something illegal, like trespassing or whatever. Didn't bus stations close at some point? I didn't want to get caught by a guard, so I quickly shoved my laptop in my bag. I was ready to go when bright headlights blinded me from the other side of the window. A bus was pulling in, its engine growling, dispersing the fog around it. I shielded my eyes, surprised that there were still buses at this time. I should have just shrugged and left. I wish I had. but for some reason, I got curious and kept looking, expecting to see passengers coming out of the bus. Maybe I just wanted to feel less alone and out of place. No one came out. I took a few steps forward, squinting my eyes against the light. I could see a silhouette in the driver's seat, and above his head, a display showing the stops on his route in blocky red letters. It flashed to Bellamont, and my heart leaped. That was my hometown. I rushed outside and walked up to the bus. The door was still closed, but I could see the driver through a narrow pane of glass. He was looking straight ahead, and light above his seat fighting with the shadows under his hat. I lifted a fist to knock on the door, but hesitated. A feeling of dread took over me for no reason. I felt it course through my veins, starting from my arms and spreading through my chest, like a fevered chill. I looked around the loading dock, but the night was so dark that I couldn't see much past the series of illuminated parking spots in front of the building. For a second, I almost felt like I was stranded on an island in the middle of a void. Like there was nothing else beyond what I could see. It's hard to explain, but my head spun for a second, almost like vertigo. I remember thinking that I was just tired. I told myself this was my last chance to get home that night, and it would be silly not to try. The thought of sleeping in my queen-size bed was enough to pull me out of this strange, dizzying feeling, and knock on the door. I still hate myself for it. The driver looked down at me from behind the glass, his entire face pinched in a frown. "Are you going to Belmont?" I yelled through the door. He didn't react at all at first, as if he hadn't heard me. Just as I was about to repeat myself, he nodded slowly. I tried my best smile. "Can I get in?" Again, he just stared at me, not making a move. I should have taken the hint and left, but I really wanted to get home. I fished for my ticket in the front pocket of my backpack and plastered it on the glass. "I missed the 8 p.m. bus. Is there any chance you can take me in?" I waited a beat and added, "Please?" He kept on staring for a few more seconds, just enough to give me the creeps, but he finally pulled on the lever to open the door. His movements were slow, as if he was drowning in sludge, and any shift of his muscles took all of his energy. I stood there with my backpack, the fog rising through the open door. I waited for him to confirm that it was okay for me to get on board, but he said nothing, just kept staring. My smile faltered. Hesitantly, I grabbed onto the railing and took a step up. He didn't protest, so I just hopped the last few steps, mumbling a quick "thank you" as I passed him. I made my way to a seat towards the back, relieved to have made it on board. Just like the station, the bus was completely empty, but I remember being happy about that. I'd had my fair share of overcrowded bus rides, so having a bus all to myself for once sounded like a dream. I'd be able to get some sleep in, I thought. How stupid of me. I jumped when the bus hissed to life, the door closing with a screech. I scoffed at how on edge I was, and told myself to relax. I got my earbuds out as the bus pulled out from the loading dock, and settled in my seat, getting ready for the ride. By the time we got on the highway, I was already dozing off to some random chill mix I'd found on YouTube. When I woke up, something was off. I don't really know how to explain it. It was that feeling of dread and anxiety, filling every inch of my chest, and radiating through my back. Like when you're alone at home and you turn off all the lights, but you feel a presence behind you at every turn. My earbuds had fallen off while I slept, so I could hear the rumbling of the road underneath the wheels. Other than that, everything was dead quiet. I got up to stretch a bit, looking around the darkened bus. There were still no passengers other than me, and yet I had a distinct sensation that I wasn't alone at the back of the bus. I scratched my neck, trying to get rid of the chilled feeling at the base of my head. I glanced at the bus driver. He was looking straight ahead at the road, his arms barely moving as he manned the steering wheel. Maybe I was just creeped out by his presence. That's when I heard it, a subtle scratch, like a nail on leather, or maybe a claw. It sounded really close and far at the same time, and I couldn't pinpoint a direction where it was coming from. It lasted maybe half a second, but it was strange enough to get my full attention. I whipped my head around, wondering if some kind of animal had hitched a ride, but everything was still quiet, unmoving. I stood there, all my muscles tensing, waiting to hear if the sound would come back. It didn't, so I sat down, a little more unnerved. I remember being terrified that a bat had found its way on the bus, as if that would have been the worst case scenario. Now I wish it had been a bat, or even 100 bats. The noise happened again a few times over the next hour, but I could never pinpoint the source. It was driving me nuts. Then it dawned on me that maybe there was an animal stuck in the bathroom. That was the only place I couldn't really see. I didn't particularly want to come face to face with a rabid bat, but I also really needed to know where that weird noise was coming from. I made my way down the aisle, passing a few rows of seats. At some point, a dark smudge appeared in the periphery of my vision to my right, but I didn't dwell on it. I absentmindedly rubbed my eye and kept going. When I reached the bathroom door, I placed my ear on it and waited. Nothing. The green vacant sign near the handle was lit up, but I still knocked and waited another beat or two. Still nothing. I pushed open the door with my foot, not wanting any skin showing part of me inside if there was a bat in there. The hard plastic creaked a little, sending creepy shivers down my spine. I jumped when the bathroom light turned on automatically and almost ran away, but managed to calm myself down. I looked inside the small space, inspecting the yellowed toilet seat, the mirror speckled with water drops, and the tiny sink from afar. Nothing moved in there. Nothing was alive that I could see. I removed my foot and the door snapped closed. Relieved, I turned around to make my way back to my seat. I noticed again a dark smudge at the corner of my vision, but this time it was on the other side. I blinked hard, wondering if I had an eyelash stuck in my left eye. I kept walking, rubbing my eye until it burned. That's when I heard another noise. This time it was clearly coming from behind me, and it was more like plastic slowly sliding across the surface. I stopped and turned around in the aisle. The first thing I noticed was that the smudge was back, but on the right side again. The second thing was that the vacant sign on the bathroom door had shifted to occupied. Warmth drained from my whole body. I stood there frozen. Only a few moments ago, there had been no one in the bathroom and no one behind me. I stood at the door long enough to notice that the dark smudge in the periphery of my vision was swirling slowly, like gray milk on a black coffee. Yet every time I tried to look at it directly, it disappeared. I did it a few times as I started panicking, looking straight at it. Nothing. Looked away, there it was. Again and again, very fast, unable to stop myself. I wanted to examine it so bad to understand what it was, but I just couldn't. I took a few steps back and realized the smudge was anchored in the same place, right above a seat a few rows down. My breath caught in my throat. I looked directly at the seat for a while, my heart beating in my ears. Everything looked normal, but when I finally dared to move my eyes away, the smudge reappeared in the periphery of my vision. Bigger, closer. A scream caught in my throat. I fumbled back, then ran to my seat, searching for my phone with trembling hands. I texted my mom, but there was no signal. We were on a stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere, darkness surrounding us through the windows. The sudden feeling of being stranded and alone hit me so hard that it knocked the wind out of me. I looked towards the bus driver. He seemed completely unaware of what was happening at the back of the bus. I considered asking him to stop so that I could get off. Every cell in my body was telling me to run. Honestly, I wish I had listened. But my logical brain kicked in and pointed out that it was dangerous to walk on the side of the highway, in the dark, and that it would be no better out there in the night than in here. I convinced myself that I was just having a panic attack, and that I couldn't trust myself to make the right decision until I calmed down. So I sat down and closed my eyes, forcing myself to take breaths. I told myself that it was just an illusion, probably caused by the dim light reflecting on the window, or a weird shadow created by the seat. Nothing to worry about. And as for the bathroom sign, it must have slid when I let the door slam shut by itself. That was all. I reminded myself that in about 2 hours, I'd be safe and sound at the bus station in Belmont. I even imagined myself telling the story to my mom and laughing about it with her. She'd no doubt give me a logical reason for what had happened. She was good at calming me down when I was claustrophised like that. All I had to do was sit tight until then, and try not to think about it. I bit my nails obsessively for the next 30 minutes, trying to concentrate on an ebook I had downloaded on my phone. It was pointless, as no words really made it through the thick fog of anxiety in my mind. And then the bus rocked, violently. I screamed as I was shoved towards the window, hitting my head on it. I hadn't even had time to react before the bus rocked backward, Slamming my body against the seat in front of me, I grabbed a hold of the headrest and stood up, calling out to the driver. "What's happening?" It took me a second to realize that there was now a dark smudge directly to my left. I whimpered, looked straight at it to make it disappear, and I looked back towards the bathroom to see if the shadow was still there. It was, and there was another one to the left as well, swirling by the corner of my eyes, bigger than the other two. The bus rocked again, almost making me fall. I yelled at the bus driver, panic strangling my voice into a shrill. The shadow across the aisle from me seemed to grow larger. I closed my eyes, my entire body tensing with fear, then ran towards the front of the bus. I didn't look back, but I swear I could feel the shadows behind me, looming like a spider crawling up my spine. When I reached the driver, I put my hand on his shoulder. "Something is wrong. Please stop the bus." He didn't react. I moved to his side to get his attention, and froze. His face had disappeared, leaving behind a featureless head, like an egg-shaped sack of skin under a hat. His hands were still on the steering wheel, adjusting it slightly as if he was still consciously driving. The world spun, and my vision blackened for a moment. It took everything I had to will myself not to pass out. I grabbed onto the railing behind me, my legs wobbly. Outside, the bus's headlights illuminated a small portion of the road as it sped through the highway, looking eerily normal. Everything shook again, almost sending me flying down the stairs. Yet there was nothing outside that could cause the bus to rock so much. It was as if we were partly in the real world and partly outside of it. "You're not supposed to be here," said a voice coming from the driver. I snapped my head back towards him. He now had a face, but it was a grotesque excuse for a human being. His nose was crooked and asymmetrical. Both eyes looked different and weren't at the same height. His skin was deeply wrinkled, like that of an old lady. The whole thing looked strangely familiar in a horrifying way. "You shouldn't be here," the thing repeated, its voice womanly and almost soothing, a sharp contrast to its appearance. I suddenly realized why it looked so familiar. It was like a mix of my grandma and my mom. I recognized my grandma's favorite blue eyeshadow on a brown eye that looked like hers, the high cheekbone of my other grandma under her blue eye, and my mom's mole near the nose. It was as if the monster had tried to conjure up something I could relate to. "How do I get out?" I whispered, my vocal cords paralyzed by fear. The unblinking, unmoving face stared at me. "Get in the bathroom." The bus was now trembling and shaking like an unending earthquake. That's when the noise started. It was a deep, vibrating growl, barely audible. I felt it more than I heard it. But it grew and morphed as it expanded. It was sometimes guttural and sometimes more of a deep scratching, like a train's emergency brake. It got so loud that it felt like it was taking up space around me, pushing against my skin. I thought my brain would explode. "Now," yelled the thing driving the bus. I turned around, my palms pressed against my ears, and I saw them. All the shadows in my peripheral vision, maybe 10, 20 of them. Above them, balls of blinding lights descended, and sparks flew as they touched the shadows. My eyes darted from side to side as I tried to understand what was happening, but I could never focus on anything. Everything disappeared whenever I looked straight at it. Suddenly a shadow appeared to my right, taking up almost all my side vision. "Go." The voice sounded disembodied, more like an otherworldly screech than a human speech. So I closed my eyes and ran down the aisle. I opened them once or twice to see where I was going, but every time I did, the shadows would swallow my side vision, swirly tendrils extending towards me. At some point, I swear I felt one of them touch me. It was colder than I ever felt before. It was like being burned by the void. When I finally reached the bathroom, I pushed on the door, but it was still locked. As I battled with it, I could see shadows coming towards me from the corner of my eye, and balls of light clashing with them in the background. My brain couldn't make sense of what was happening. There was just so much noise, and shaking, and sparks and darkness. I started kicking and punching the door, desperate to get in, and managed to get it open. I rushed in and closed the door behind me, putting all my weight on it to keep it shut. The sound had become a permanent screech that vibrated in my brain and made me scream, my fingers shoved in my ears. I remember a violent shake, and feeling that the bus had been lifted from the ground, and then I blacked out. When I woke up, everything was quiet and dark. I first felt the asphalt against my cheek, the fresh air on my face. The air smelled like wet dirt. Relief. My backpack was on the ground next to me. I found my phone nearby. The screen was cracked, but it was still working, so I used it to shine a light around me. I was on the side of the highway, alone. There was nothing else but me and my stuff. No bus, no shadows, no lights. I walked a few miles until I found a signal, then called my mom to pick me up. I told her the entire thing, from start to finish. She threatened to drive me straight to the hospital and have me on psych hold. She didn't have any explanation to calm me down, and we didn't laugh. I ended up telling her I must have fallen asleep and had a nightmare. She didn't ask how I'd ended up on the side of the street in the middle of nowhere. I didn't point it out. I don't know what happened that night on that bus. If anyone has any idea, please let me know. I'm still trying to figure it out. In all the research I've done, I've never heard of anything like this. For a few years I convinced myself that I'd had a psychotic breakdown, but after finding this sub, I'm convinced that it all happened exactly as I remember it. All I know is that I'll never set foot on a bus again.